Let me tell you what we're doing here and what we've organized for your Friday evening edification. SCI-Arc about 3 years ago determined that there would be a designation, a special designation for faculty, and the nomenclature is distinguished faculty. So the head director of the school has the option or the opportunity within a 5-year period to appoint at least 3 and maybe more. And I took advantage of that opportunity and appointed 3 faculty members who you all know well. Michael Rotondi, Jeff Kipnis, and Hernan Diaz Alonzo. So those are the 3 distinguished faculty members. And the idea of the program, which is evolving, had to do with publications, had to do with lectures, forums, symposia, and so on. So pursuant to that, this is the first instance. And what we decided to do was to bring the 3 distinguished. You'll have to confirm the fact that they're distinguished, but the 3 nominally distinguished faculty members to a discourse. And what I've done is to put together 4 pairs of images and text. So I think the first one is 3 rather than 2. And the way that I'd like to do it is to have each of the 3, you guys can come up, why don't you come up and sit? Yeah, maybe not. So don't come, so you're gonna have to go back and forth. They rotate? Okay, so what I did was to select, in the first case, 3 images, which will run consecutively, and then we'll go, Wendy will run that, we'll go back and forth. And then what I'd like to do is to have each of the distinguished faculty members comment on the content, substance, meaning, lack thereof. I think the only thing that we ask, and I think the reason the distinguished designation was made was the sense that there was something about each of these characters in a single-minded way, that they belonged in a certain sense, and I know we did this discussion with respect to Raymond earlier today, that they belong to their own opinion, their own vantage point, their own way of thinking and seeing, rather than something that seemed to be more generic or derivative, and so on. So that what I think we should expect in a critical, intellectual way is some independence of opinion, which means notwithstanding the conventional rules of congeniality and civility, that we expect people to give their opinions and to agree or to disagree. So it's not a kind of, it's not intended to be a sort of massage, backslapping, great work session necessarily, but to give thoughtful opinions on some material which is not so simple. So that being said, kindly produce the first salubrious image. So this is yeah. So this is obviously supremely topical. I apologize for the imprecision of the image, but maybe that serves the architects better. We'll see. This is a recent article from the Manchester Guardian. Some of you have probably seen it. My friends sent it to you, and the quote is from Richard Rogers. The quote on the bottom. Next one. This is This is an interesting piece. I dug this out this morning. This is Lewis Mumford and his critique of Saarinen's U.S. Embassy in London. Maybe it's too damn long, and I apologize, because when you put stuff up like this, there's so many words. The problem in creating such a building, he's talking about the one in Grosvenor Square. The problem in creating such a building, not unlike the problem an American lecturer faces addressing a foreign audience, of retaining his individuality, his national idiom, without making any blatant assertion of his Americanism, being in fact a better representative of our many-faceted, maybe that's a point to pay some attention to, national tradition by showing his ability to find common ground with his host. The ambassador is not the tact to do this, should be kept at home. The embassy that cannot create a likable image of our country has not fulfilled the main purpose. And then the next one, and this is Saarinen's U.S. Embassy. And conceptually, there might be a question of whether the new one is an advance on the old one or not. So those are the three. You want to see them again? We go back and forth? No? Mike? Or no? Yeah? We go around again? So you can, huh?
The American Embassy.
This is the result of a very recent and much debated competition, invited competition. I ran through the GSA. You want to just flip the three for 2 seconds? So, why don't you want to come on?
Oh, you're not going to do them all?
No, we do. No, we can't do them all. We're going to go crazy. So, I guess I forgot to mention my apologies. The way this has been set up, originally the discussion with the distinguished faculty was imagined as a discussion that actually didn't involve anyone except the faculty. And this would be done in a more closeted circumstance. And I think when this was set up and Chris arranged it, there is an opportunity for other faculty members, Coy, Elena, Chris, and Ming, to respond to the comments. I think the focus is on Mike, Jeff, and Hernan, and then after they speak on this subject, then maybe we'll take a shot, 1 or 2 people, but we don't want to occupy the whole session. It's Friday night, everybody has to do other things. So we have to keep it. We do, I don't know about you. So
I think it's good you managed to get the whole school here anyway. So
it's nice to hear somebody laugh today, I have to say. That is a tough day. So Jeff, would you please go ahead.
Clearly Hernan has done much better work than that embassy. I'm surprised to see him do that kind of work, but just bring on. But it is important that he's making the judgments necessary to develop a professional practice, and I think I admire his growth. Actually, it's fairly simple for me to come down on these 3 things because I so utterly am revolted by all 3. I think Munford couldn't have been wrong. Then, the idea, for me, for a critic to imagine themselves to speak in the name of and for an audience that he calls multifaceted, as if he can grasp the whole multifaceted issue. Munford is a problem for me. This is a particular problem for me. There's a new report, or there was a report for the competition for the embassy commissioned by the U.S. Embassy Architectural Commission for the General Accounting, General whatever that thing's called. It was discussing about what the contemporary architecture should be of the embassy. And it starts off with a paragraph that's very funny. It says, and it was discussing the Grosvenor building. It says, at the time the building was built, Americans were far more concerned, or after it was built, Americans were far more concerned with the damage that they thought modern architecture had done to their lives than with the problem of terrorism. The beginning of this official report is essentially most of the career of the embassy has to do with the problems of architecture, and they're working out their issues of contemporary humanity at the expense of American identity, and only recently has stuff like the survival of the building.
Where is that?
it's in the report commissioned by, what's it called, GSA, about the status of the American embassy today. Because right after 9/11, embassies started to distribute and atomize for safety reasons. And they started to realize that not only produced a major bureaucratic problem in terms of how you organize work, but an embassy in a country of our status had to have some sense of presence in the world. And so these new embassies have been about solving the problem, about actually making something like, not an icon, but a sense of presence in the world, not being spread out, and also taking the risk of being vulnerable in order to show our national character. And that's what the thing was about. But the real argument had to do with the fact that the history of architecture, the embassy architecture, had been so badly handled by architects, and the Grosvenor building was the one that they were citing. For me, architecture's capacity to serve instantiated power as its primary face is its greatest history and its greatest achievement, and it's not one to be misunderstood, whether that be religious or governmental. However, it's such a known and important repertoire. I mean, it's such a well-known repertoire of devices that the capacity of an architect today looking at the embassy, I think, should be to find some way of, I don't know the word, it's not about modesty, but it's about, basically there's an architectural role for an embassy today that requires an extreme rethink.
See, the embassy is not a creative problem. I would question it.
I think, why the heck can you say that? The embassy is, it's like, how do you dress?
No, it's,
No, I wanted to see how you said that.
okay, I would say it's a creative problem if you can actually challenge the program.
Right.
If there's some way of turning it from a skin job into a spatial proposition. And I'm not, and the spatial proposition is they don't want any of that stuff flying out in anybody on the street. So it's really a problem of security and a problem of making a building that's symbolic of whatever it's got to be symbolic. But there's no possibility, unless somebody here knows, Tom may say, there's no possibility of challenging the program.
Well, you were in that conversation. So you don't have your project.
I don't know. I really don't think about these things until somebody asks me about these kind of things. Well, first, then everybody to show up on a Friday night. I mean, prove their commitment to the discussion of architecture, or that your social life sucks. Either way, here we are. To me, there are two. Yeah, these are social life. Even exactly part of us. Specifically to this problem, there are two things that come to mind. One is, which have to do with the particular condition of this competition, and then I will comment on the problem of the embassy. One is, I find it incredibly appalling that in these days, the problem of lack of originality, or the way that architecture transfer idea, borrow, or steal, or is directly rip off, and nobody call on it, I find that absolutely disgusting and a big problem, because if nobody can see that this project is a complete rip-off of a theater somewhere else, that to me is, again, that's not just an embassy problem, it is in general with the state, I would say, the criticism in architecture, but also I think among practitioners too, which the certain lack of ambition and originality is not, seems to be a crime anymore, or the excess ambition for originality doesn't seem to be worth enough. So that is kind of a footnote, not a major conceptual problem, but one that as a designer worries me big time. The second question, the second point that comes to mind in relation to what Michael said is, I'm not so sure if, and Tom did this competition, as an architect who has certain interests, I'm not so sure if you wanted to be doing an embassy for the United States in this time and age as an architect. I don't know if it's a problem that it will introduce enough latitude to what you want to achieve in one part. The other part is, what is the role, I mean, an embassy like that, which is glass and is happy and friendly and all the things, do they have a competition, let's say, for an embassy in Pakistan, or a competition for an embassy
clear.
in
It's in an ideological sense, it's an environmental building, or it purports to be that. And-
Well, I don't think it probably is.
Okay, I didn't say it was good, I just said that's what it was. I missed that point so far, so that if you looked at it as a kind of prognosis from an American vantage point of where architecture is supposed to be going, ergo, some jury said, let's do this, it means that. So this is also worth talking about.
Yeah, but an environmental building, every building that will get built from today on will be increasingly responsible, will not become more environmental because of architects' desire to make them more environmental. They'll become more environmental because of the law. And so in the end, I think the problem here is exactly the problem Mumford stated. It's an image problem. I think it's very clear what this image is. All you have to do is look at the ground and the form. It's an e pluribus unum image. It's multifaceted on each side, making a cube in the center and being light. And so essentially it's a trite image of what America stands for. I believe it's its intention. I mean, I don't know.
It stands for in London.
Yeah, not in London, it's actually, is it in London?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, what I wonder is if we do an embassy in Pakistan, how that would be.
Well, I mean, when you did an embassy in Pakistan, why would you discuss an embassy in Pakistan in relationship to this building? I mean, it is in London.
No, I'm talking about in terms of what Mumford quote is there. It is some kind of uniform attitude.
You know,
If you believe
the
what
broader
Mumford
identity.
said, and Mumford was, I mean, what's interesting about your point in terms of religions or tyrannies in the production of buildings,
Right.
as far as I know, we're not quite either a religion or a tyranny. So the complexity of what American society might be, at least ideally, is a different image to produce or to render than something like this, which it seems to me is at best single-minded and in fact simple-minded, a sort of simple-minded image of what constitutes in the minds of the architects and the jurors virtue, the coming virtue, which has to do with a kind of rote environmentalism, and that's the end of the image. And in fact, that's not what America is at all. That might be a piece of it.
I'm
So it's
curious,
a
but
very-
you think the design, the material and formal design of the exterior, I think Michael is right. There is no spatial argument, and there won't be a programmatic spatial argument. And I think increasingly, for example, Alejandro makes the point that basically planning, interior planning and programming have been taken away from architects by boutique specialty consulting firms, and they are increasingly doing external images. But external images is one of the problems that we can do. What I'm trying to get from you is, do you believe its environmental performance is a significant attribute of its architecture?
Is it what?
A significant attribute of its architecture?
Every time you talk.
That was the chair squeaking. I thought it was something else. I didn't really want to. I'm sorry.
I was camouflaged.
What do you think? I'm no doubt, because I've heard many good architects do that, every square inch of that facade can be accounted for by the degree to which it does nothing else but support the environmental performance without any additions to anything whatsoever.
That's right.
Much
And
like
that's
the
right,
San
and that's
Francisco.
wrong.
Yeah, that's wrong. So this is a building, look at the circles.
Yeah.
Are those environmentally?
But I was leaving that alone, the moats and the walls, because I think that's a different discussion. I'm just talking about the box.
The box in a moat, not just the box. The box, it's the Whitney
They're
Museum.
alligators.
I mean, honestly, it's the Whitney Museum. It's essentially saying,
You know, probably the most influential, after Oklahoma, when they blew up the building, they said the most influential architect in the country was Timothy McVeigh.
architect.
Yeah. That,
Who's they said that?
yeah, these guys that drive around in the
Do
truck.
you agree with that?
Same here, same here. It could be, you could say Al-Qaeda, whomever, but it's a very limited problem.
But let me ask you something. Don't you think this building is meant to look fragile? Meant to look vulnerable? Meant to look willing to be
transparent and friendly, you know.
friendly? I don't know that friendly. It seems.
When it looks down, most of them.
It doesn't look defensive.
Why don't we do this? You want to take a shot at
I
that?
actually wanted to ask a question because I think none of you really comment on the boxiness of the embassies in both cases.
my comment was simply that the Americans had so reviled modernism that they wanted their embassies to be more late 19th century. But I think the boxiness has to do with simply the ability to make a clear statement about uniform. The glass has to do with the strength and fragility. I mean, its legibility as a piece of public art is trivial and trite. But it's also an eminently forgettable work. I mean, the other thing is, I'm curious why, in a certain sense, we discuss it because it was a recent project. Seems like it should be an important project. After 9/11 happened and, Bush came out and said, we have to lead our lives normally. Go shopping and go traveling. Remember this? Immediately, the thing that started to change first were all the federal building regulations for federal buildings and any building receiving federal money. So to lead your life normally meant behave in every way normally except how we go. Which had to become increasingly defensive, and it had to meet all sorts. The Seattle Library was put 2 years behind schedule and got overstructured because of its requirement. So I definitely think the quality of architectural performance that we know it capable of is not part of the discussion in the public domain of the quality of life.
Yeah, the closing question, I think, was a little bit skirted. It seems that we're in a school, and
A little louder.
We're in a school, and it seems that the major, any issue which everyone wrestles with here has to do with this issue of expression, this issue of what the embodies, communicates, etc. And to make it very, very simple, on one hand, we can talk about sort of mute minimalism. This first case would be mute minimalism with decoration, my characterization of it. On the other hand, we could posit what might be sort of provocative gesturalism in terms of the interest of multifaceted expression. So there's a polarity there, right? So what's the position that's really viable relative to this particular case in terms of that discussion? Because you're criticizing this, but there's basically no sort of articulation of what might be a viable sort of stance.
Well, I'm criticizing this on the basis of knowing other projects and other similar situations. I'm thinking about the same, what are government buildings or government-like buildings in situations where there's a context in which they're expected to make something like a statement about the governmental institution in this context. So it's funny that you mentioned the formalisms of the work, because those are basically, in retrospect, abstract, but they're not abstract. They're basically a kind of result of essential common sense.
Exactly.
So they're not actually art issues. The project I think would have been not funny here, but interesting to consider here is we saw Frank Gehry's Andorra Museum, which was a highly contemporary, remember his name? It looked like a big, frankly, if you'll forgive me, like a big turd. But it was black, had lots of different chunks in it, had wonderful multifaceted things. It was, I don't know if you know, it would have been an extraordinary, I think, act of humor, self-effacement, generosity. It was more like the Americans. I mean, for the last 8 years before Obama got elected, I basically, wherever I went in the world, told people I was from Canada. And that was a little sad, because even though I was safer, I also...
With your southern accent, you got by with it?
Yeah, I was from South Canada. And what was funny about that was, they liked me more, but they also, at that point on, they knew that there was nothing funny going to come out of my mouth, because there was nothing funny comes out of Canada. Sorry, so I don't know. I think these are extremely interesting issues to talk about in an architectural setting among architects, because I really think they define the way, not the way we relate to one another, and the effects that we know are really important, like the things Michael was talking about, but essentially the effects that we continue to be commissioned to produce, which we mostly think of as trivial.
The reason I raised it is that given the prominence of the project, given the exposure of the project, given the fact that it's sitting next to the Thames, and given the fact that there's a pretty clear new allegiance, a road allegiance to the meaning of green and populist and self-effacing in that sense. And that to reward a project which seems to be simple-minded in that regard, however sophisticated the skin might be, and you have to imagine these buildings over many, many years, the technology in this context moving and changing and evolving. And to me, the point, because the audience is a student audience who is looking at this and reading about this and making decisions in a personal way about how to prioritize the content of work. Where is it going? Where should it be going? Why is this project that says America in Europe being rendered in this way? I think that's really, you want to say something, Chris?
Well, I think that this project is really about the conflation of two things. One is the logistical operations that the embassy in Pakistan or London have to contend with. And I think the other one is struggling with the idea of what makes an image that's in some ways coherent for a population abroad, not to us, but to others. And so this is a little bit of everything, and I, as a Canadian, I think what's humorous about it is really the way that the construction of power, the thing that's absolutely eminent, is made tangible and visible at all times. So the strength of it lies in its isolation, its determination, its single will, and it's not trying to be any part of the city, particularly the place where city is the exact idea of how one makes oneself.
I think it's America, it's advertising.
Absolutely.
But I wonder if is it possible, though, is it possible?
I was confused there, he said, talk to Mike.
Okay, the problem is limited because of logistics, symbolism, and all of that. But maybe it's not so limited. Maybe the problem that I would see, which is to restrict the architect from doing something more than just that. Is it possible to expose the problem, expose all the problems, in a way that the building becomes all of the things that it's supposed to be afraid of, or all the things that it's not supposed to do.
That's why you do the competition.
Well,
If you think you can do that. I mean, the Foster, the Reichstag discussion is, while not literal equivalent, but in a very different way, because it purports to represent the kind of egalitarianism, openness, open government, and so on and so on. This is, it's transparent. Everybody, what they don't say is that to make a deal, they all go out in the parking lot and figure out what to do, and then they come in and they trend.
But as you would say, architecture needs an enemy. Maybe the embassy needs an enemy too, when you're designing it.
But the enemy should be the host city.
but listen, I haven't seen.
No, it's not the city, I'm saying the enemy is.
But this diagram to me suggests that it's a Pleasant Park.
The enemy are all the imaginary forces that we think
This
are
is a
going to...
citadel.
Pleasant Park. Here's the thing about Canada. Chris Genik, here's my thoughts. Warm, intimate, sensitive, caring, fun. Which one of those doesn't belong to that equation? So it's nice of you to say it's a park. I mean, you see it as a kind of goodwill gesture.
I mean, I see it as one that's wanting to set itself apart from what the city is.
Okay, but
I don't see it as a park. I don't see it as a good version of what any good park is in London, which I know really well. I think of it as a place that wants to be actually its own portrait.
Yeah,
And it's restating basically what Americans have become in the world at large, and in Europe in particular.
But see, I think you're reading and my reading, I think I agree with you completely, but those are subtle, those are innuendos of the work.
But architecture is a
Being
political
disguised
gesture,
behind-
but surely architecture.
Let's do this, guys. Let's jump to the next one.
Hold on, can I say one thing about this? Because I think part of the argument is we are focusing all in the box. I mean, this was a bunker. It's sitting in a bunker. Hold on, the new one.
The ground floor is building at an amphitheater and a library that you can walk in and.
No, I agree, but my point is, in the new one, in the new embassy, we are focusing the box, but we're not focusing in the park and the circles and so on, which is for me a big chunk of the problem, because that box of glass is like any generic commercial thing that a film like this will do. What I start to figure it out is the idea that we are breaking the fortress into some kind of a fake sense of fortress, which is not, but it still is, because the whole problem is in the fleet, and how that is what operates still as an embassy, because aside the big American flag, there's nothing that calls this as an embassy. Like if you go in Buenos Aires to the US embassy, it's no doubt in your mind that that's the US embassy. Because it's the thing that it looks like a
What's the problem of the US to Londoners?
none.
That's not true, actually.
Well, in theory, none.
Wow, that's what maybe that's the US version, but certainly not the British perspective on the.
But part of the problem, I think we're putting too much energy in the iconic symbolism part of the embassy, and I think there is something about that project that it really, for me, is incredibly generic. Like other 50 projects that are going up right now from a tech park to an office building to even museums. So I don't know to what point the value of that, I mean, and again, I think it's a topic for discussion. The symbolism and iconicity and all that is still
any
valuable.
building of this scale in the middle of one of the cities, the world's major cities, can be just a logistical operation.
I agree with you. I just say.
I know, it would be interesting to compare the American embassy, the American embassy in Berlin, and also Michael Welford and Sterling's British embassy in Berlin.
Or Rem's Dutch embassy.
Dutch
in
embassy,
London.
or the Dutch embassy in Berlin also. Yeah. You know, basically you'll see different, I mean, what you would see is different efforts to portray aspects of the nation to another nation, not as such, but in other words, communicate America to the United States, I mean to Berlin, as opposed to communicate America as such. I just think when no one seems to answer me is, we collectively know that those effects are not just trivial, they're like, I know, I haven't seen Tom Skinner, but I pretty much know there'll be a lot of parts and they won't fit together. And there'll be a lot of parts and they won't fit together, and there'll be a kind of clumsiness to it because that's not only the work he does, but also I think that's his sense of what his architecture's relationship with communities that it discusses is. It will probably at first glance seem off-putting to the audience. And so this is the Pepsi Cola. You know how Pepsi Cola beats Coca-Cola in taste tests? It's really simple. Cola taste tests are based on the first sip. Pepsi Cola put lots of sugar, more sugar than Coca-Cola, so when you take the first sip, it's sweeter, you like it better, but more people will finish a 6-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola than will finish a 6-ounce or a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola, then they'll finish a 12-ounce can. But Pepsi Cola, frankly, I want the architecture to be about finishing the can, not putting the first taste test. You know, but I just
See, people that give me my facts.
No, he's making it up. Nobody knows enough to refute.
Okay. Can we hold on? Let's go to the.
It sounds
They're distinguished.
I think it's not about the slide, but I actually think that Jeffrey, you talked about something which has to do with substance, right?
I'm sorry,
What you just described has to do with substance, and how you have to, in all of this work, versus this one with the new embassy, or any kind of architecture, it's the question is how do you put certain meaning into the piece of work? And I mean, I would have to pose the question with the architects here, Michael and Henan, is that each one of you would approach your work very differently from that point of view, and how do you put meaning in your work? So, whether Pepsi has more sugar, and sugar is not a substance, sugar is basically what makes you become an addict.
Yeah, let's leave that. We don't have to defend the Pepsi yet. Why don't we move to the next one, and if we want to reference the previous, let's. This is Michael's project in Hollywood next to Rams, and all the connotations that might have. And then the next one is a quote from John Haydock: "I can't do a building without doing a new repertoire of characters, stories, language, and it's parallel. It's not just building per se, it's building worlds. If nothing else, the previous project, if it built a world at all, it's singular, not plural. You wanna comment on that, Mike?
But, say the question again?
This is a quote, and the previous building belongs to you. So, it has to do with the conceptualization of the building in Hollywood, and how it was done, and why it was done, and things like that.
I love the building. Do you feel like you're doing worlds when you're doing
Doing rules.
I mean, it's not an accidentally picked. I think Henan did actually work to fabricate alternative worlds to a world that he believed he found intolerable. There's no sense of intolerance for me in your Hollywood project.
No, I think there's a character in the movie some years ago, lots of years ago, that was that clarified something for me. It had to do with the I don't know, just this really deep need to say to not have to negotiate anything, to be as pure as we're talking about framing. In the creative state, we've often been shown characters that are self-destructive and assume that they're always self-destructive. I saw in this movie how somebody who would go into this creative state was in a world of utter peace, total joy. And then when he came back out into the world is when the difficulty began. Couldn't negotiate the world. Thus, shot right in the mouth, taken off your ear, hypodermic in the arm, whatever. Lots of things ensued, but I began to wonder how to negotiate the world and still remain standing. In architecture, you either don't have any clients and you don't have to negotiate, or you have clients and you have to negotiate. This was an extreme for me. Working with multinational corporations to do a building on probably the most expensive piece of land in the city, because there's 5 million people that are Roman Chinese, and then to figure out what to do on that site, where I don't have any control also over the inside. The inside is basically all attraction, so it's basically a black box, and how to make this box not so black as well. So it was really about creating the spaces that I remembered or imagined as a child, which is in front here. So the building just becomes an armature for the public space. And public space also, as a child, I always remembered all the places that I had been where I wanted to be able to climb or be on top of or be in the middle of the space. So that's basically what that whole front is about. It's not about looking a certain way. Ultimately, that's part of it.
That's Pepsi calling.
Sylvia.
Your checks-
Sylvia wanted to chime in, that's right.
Your checks. I think the point is that if you understood that the world could be other than it is, if you understood that architecture had some capacity to reimagine it. For instance, the narrative, I haven't seen any of the other schemes, but if you take the off-putting you could make a very powerful argument for that idea abstractly. It has a hell of a lot to say, actually, in a very honorable way about what is America. People sitting on the jury may not like it, or the Senate, or the House, or the Supreme Court, but you could imagine, when you're talking about creating another world, or what's coming, or another way to see, meaning another way to think, another way to feel. And I guess the question is that happening here? What's the vision of Hollywood, of the movies, of the street? I mean, if you walk up and down Hollywood Boulevard, from the Pantages to what they've redone in the Roosevelt Hotel. And they're remaking Hollywood in a certain way. So it's a zone of new development in the city, and one that there's a certain amount of discussion attached to that. So how is it, aside from let's make this one, let's make housing, and let's make an expo stop, how is it re-understood now? It's there, we make it again. So how are we doing that? What's the pro forma? I think Hayduck is talking about that.
Well, except, I mean, when I'm really glad to find out that Michael didn't do the interior of this. When I went there, I was I didn't know the public space memory, but I thought, wow, I think the architecture of this is really interesting. And it doesn't feel like it needs to resist, in the classic sense, the destitutions of image culture that are the very essence, in some sense, of what Hollywood is. You know, you see it. And then essentially it found a way of producing a reality about a memory of an image. Now that you say that, but in other words, it's not real in the Abraham sense versus fake, and it's not other worlds in the Hayek sense versus a world that he found unbearable. There is a way to be in this world and work architecturally and not, and find, I would say, kind of collaboration in a certain sense. And I think it's a very optimistic project for me, and I really appreciated that about it. It also is a project that allowed, I'm very interested in fighting with Banham's four ecology model of Los Angeles, because Los Angeles, the four ecology models means there's a kind of essential condition that the architect grows out of the circumstance. The circumstance of Los Angeles is entirely fabricated, entirely temporary, and entirely imagined, and that's its reality. So it's not that I don't understand or don't agree with the analysis of Banham, but I think what we did in the last 40 years was grow more psychologically sensitive, politically sensitive, culturally sensitive, and philosophically sensitive about how we handle architectural problems in completely new circumstances, of which Los Angeles is one. So for me, this is a perfect, not a four ecologies building, but also a way of understanding that there's a provisional sense of reality which is distinguishable from image construction. And the building allows that to coexist.
I mean, I'm not certain of anything, I'm not certain whether it does this, but one of the questions that I've been on, the personal side that finds its way into the public side is it possible to find a middle ground between applied meaning and inherent meaning? And it comes from a sense of meaning is a being. Now in architecture we can't do this because we have to do something completely without memory. But is it possible for something to have presence and at the same time be somewhat neutral?
I take issue to with respect to yours, it means clinging to an idea of meaning in the sense of interpretation. And that's why I was part of a group of people who decided to shift the argument from meaning to effects. So it doesn't matter to me if anyone can paraphrase or interpret or get. And I certainly think that architecture's sense of obligation to memory more than the future is something that we should not just take for granted like we did this afternoon. The joy of a 10th century building finding new expression in contemporary life. Yeah, so architecture seems to me, as among almost all cultural practices, the one that draws its energy from history and negotiates its existence with the exigencies of the present. It doesn't really imagine futures anymore because it went through a bad period of time of imagining futures.
But I think quickly defining applied meaning would be, it looks like this, regardless of any of the negotiations that could come through.
Are you saying it can't be done? I mean, the London, for instance, is an imagining of the future.
Do you think so?
That's yeah, I do think so.
I think it's a little bit of a lack of memory of the past as well. I mean, I think that when you base an American building, especially an embassy, on European ground, and there is clear attention, and it's not actually the tension that we see nowadays with the war, but actually a war that we lost as European and American won. And we have a strong association between modernism in terms of architecture and what caused World War II. I think certain association of architecture and power are actually much stronger in Europe than what it is in the United States. And very often, I think in the past 50 years, American adopted an aesthetic that has no meaning for architectural purpose, whereas they are very loaded when it comes to the country. So I think somehow there is a diluted sense of power and a lack of memory, because it's not really the memory of this country, but when you go to other countries where this is a much stronger tie, I think it's much more critical, this kind of association with the box and so on.
Coy, you want to?
Well, the question of meaning to me, when architects talk about meaning, I get really nervous, because I don't think architects can make meaning. I think architects can make form, make spaces, etc., and they basically can engender those things in ways which other people in those experiences, based on their value system, make judgments, and that's the meaning of it. I think architects have a very difficult time. It's actually impossible to make meaning, because it's not something we can do. It happens in terms of
I mean, to be specific, when you look at that project,
yeah.
and we're talking about a whole series of associations in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, and topics which seem to very much belong, at least to the conventional caricature of this city. And in that context, the site and the area has a meaning, has associations. So
But
is it-
but
how does it do that? Does it
that's
do
totally
that?
individually determined. That's not universal.
I mean, I agree with Coy in the point of, I think things have meaning, and any project that you will do, it will have a meaning. I'm not so sure meaning is very useful to look at object. I think it's something that it will happen as one, and the consequence, I think, in linking to what Elena was saying, I don't think that the Sigram means the same that the National Gallery. I mean, even though the elements of architecture behaviors are similar, it doesn't mean the same thing, or the Barcelona Pavilion than the Farnsworth House. Because the meaning, I think, has to do with a bunch of other active elements. Then, for me, it doesn't interact directly with the architectural work. And I think this is open for discussion, but I'm with Coy on this. I think every time that an architect talks about meaning, or those things, I'm incredibly...
What's the difference in meaning between the Barcelona Pavilion and the National Gallery?
Easy.
What's the
I mean, I think his opposition was National Gallery and Seagram's, but.
No, yeah, I was comparing Sigrams and National Gallery, Farnsworth
It's very
Pavilion.
simple. National Gallery is the problem of where you put art in Berlin after the Second World War and 6 months after the building of the Berlin Wall. And the Seagram's building is how do you handle an argument about the ground, which is no longer loaded with, the ground in New York, which is no longer loaded with the European tradition of the way the ground is working.
Hey, come on, guys.
There's
Let's get real. Juan Monta, in Interpretations of Architecture, wrote a brilliant chapter about the changing meanings of the Barcelona Pavilion. Cultures change; those meanings shift all the time. Excuse me.
I avoided Barcelona. Listen.
But all I'm saying is meanings are not absolute. They're constantly shifting with the culture. So it's
Well, I mean, listen, I want to tell you what, I can ask every student, I can say to these students in the audience, Romeo sits out Julia's window and says, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And I ask the students what he means. They're going to say, he means, where are you? Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? And wherefore in Elizabethan English means one. You know, so there are shifting meanings there, but there is also let's say, an original meaning. That, like, for example, the National Gallery in Berlin, if you walk into that place and you don't know that you're going up the stairs, leaving the ground, going to see the carcass of a museum, going down into the crypt where the art is buried, going out into a perfect world in the sculpture art, and finding yourself exactly the same place you left, but as far away as you can be from it and go back, that's not your problem. I mean, that's not our problem. The building still does that for anyone who's interested in the architectural text it produces, just like a great Beethoven's.
yeah, it does. It has a powerful effect. It's
But it's an issue of legibility. It's an issue of
But the meaning is a
Yeah,
different.
I think it's a little different. I think it's an issue of, I think the thing, well, sorry, guys, I'm in a better mood than I was
Enjoy with a glass.
We feel like we need to speak to a constituency, and we are the only cultural practice that does that. We don't speak to constituencies. We speak to audiences. It's a small audience, and most of them are not particularly, so there's a very small audience that are hypersensitive to the kinds of discussions that we're interested in.
Yeah, it does.
Yes, that's right. The only difference between, there's only one practice I know that has a smaller audience for itself than we do, and that's poetry. Yeah, and not even poets like poetry. But almost everyone in the
And a lot of
history-
architects don't like architecture except when they produce.
I know, but so I think.
Architects don't like other architects.
And so basically, we are in control of some ham-fisted effects that the larger public is more or less sensitive to because they're ham-fisted. And then we produce a beautiful spectrum of subtlety, but for an incredibly small audience. And it has a big effect because there's so many different practices that can produce so many different bodies of effect for so many audiences. That seems to me a far more robust way of understanding the ecology of cultural practices than our constantly stating our need to serve a generic constituency.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. I feel very distinguished now, and so
Everybody convinced? Chris? Chris?
Oh, Canada.
Okay.
Congratulations, by the way.
So there's this, and there's, you want to go to the next one? This quote comes from Lanier, who is a longtime internet advocate, inventor, old Silicon Valley guy, who pretty clearly is disappointed with the use and abuse of what he calls the high culture and digital Maoism and so on and so on. And what I think he aspires to, you can read it here, what he aspires to is a way of operating in a computer where, for instance, if somebody made a grid, and the grid is the protocol, and the grid gets bent, it turns red. Or if somebody writes a sentence in a word processing context, and you don't capitalize the first letter of the sentence, it gets underlined. And the question is whether there's a different kind of mechanism which would allow a different kind of thinking, which in a way is neither black nor white, and doesn't reprimand you for following or not following a sequence of rules. Meaning, in a certain sense, what happens in the computer is what happens previous to the computer. And scripting doesn't get you off the hook either, because that also is a system of protocols. So, Hernan, you want to talk about that?
Sure. What is the question? I mean, that's what that is.
I think.
No, but not really. What is it? Is there a question there, or is it just
You know, Lanier?
The question? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just think that Lanier's point, simply, as I understand it, is the age-old point of man versus machine. We've become the hardware, and software we're producing is scripting us. How do you put a resistance to that? Now, that's also then leads to the whole discussion of what role language plays in shaping us. Any form of language.
I think it would have been in a different way, but I think this is not so different than what you said. It has to do with the representation of a process which it purports to be radical, but is essentially as conservative as the system that it inherited protocol from. So it's not what people who use it say it is, but it could be. You want to talk about your chair? Sure. When you say conceptual, I mean, you're a guy who says, I'll let the computer do it, as opposed to
No, I never said that.
I don't think
That's
that
what you
this
think
is-
I said. That's
Well, why don't you tell us what you said? I won't have to guess.
My argument with the computer, and I think you're quoting me for something I said probably 8 years ago, which we all are allowed to use mistakes. Within architecture, youth, thank God, goes far. As far as you don't build, you get to be a young architect until you're 70. But my point was that I think there was a critical shift in the relation how we use computational power, computational tools, in the sense of, and I would say specifically to
don't hide people like you or Tom or people who operate with the kind of an analog, mechanical way to approach things and see the computer, this is a tool, what the tool can do for me to understand. I would say that was the origin of the conversation, of the argument. My point 8 years ago was that I think people like me who were caught actually in the transition, because I didn't touch a computer until I was 28, so I'm not somebody who's nurtured the computational way to think any logic, but something that embraced it was that I think for me there was a shift of power in the understanding of the relation with that. It was not so much what this tool can do for me, but what can I do for you to understand. Which is different to say the computer will do it.
And the answer is?
The answer at that time, 8 years ago, was I was convinced that there was a certain religious principle about the protocol that if you create enough negotiation in that partnership, something else will come out, and there was an ambition of architecture, let's say, without authorship and ownership to understand. This chair, and the reason why I thought that you would pick the one is because my, let's say, still in my youth as an architect, not so much as a man, as my cholesterol problem proves, is that I think what you need to reshift is the relation of powership or authorship and how you own those protocols and how you can corrupt the protocols, which is the thing I'm more interested in right now, which is to find the point of failures and the point of fracture in what seems to be a pretty consolidated, solid structure to operate. And I think it has to do with, and in that sense I always been kind of an emotional kind of approach. I think it's how you shape the thing, which I would say I used to have a much more complacent or friendly relationship with that. Now I'm in a state of more of anger, and I think anger is a much more interesting fuel to produce any kind of work, or I would say the sense of beauty in anger. And I think part of the logic now is how much we can intersect with that protocols and allow you to produce a sense of authorship and individuality, and to an extreme, let's say, some logic of originality that start to put the work in a different kind of a context.
Well, let me put it another, what's the sociology? What's the sociology of the chair? You sit in it?
Yes.
I'm on it?
You sit.
In other words,
I mean, you can do all that. I mean, the point is, and things go beyond the chair. I'm not somebody who will be thinking how you sit in the chair. I mean, really, it doesn't. I don't consider that much as a logic. For me, they have to do with certain notions of what a chair is, and then how you can operate with that. You can,
no, you see that little thing right there where I sit down and sticks up my butt crack?
yeah.
So, why is that? Doesn't that hurt when I sit down?
Well, if you sit, the mesh will react in a different way. So it's not a fix.
So all benches react in a different way when I sit down.
I'm not talking you. Yeah, I mean, but again, those were.
Are you saying the chair's kinetic?
The mesh is not completely kinetic in the same way, but yes, I mean, it's not completely stable. The structure of the legs can change and the fabric change.
I actually think we've been talking about tools for a long time by now. 15 years we talked about how this tool should change our life. And actually I think for many years we just did what we knew how to do before, because that's the only thing you do. You know how to do one thing, now you have a new tool, you try to do exactly what you had before. What you knew how to do before. And I think Hernan's work in a way brought that to the extreme, meaning I'm using the computer to sculpt. I think there's nothing computational about it. It's really creativity and sculpting. I mean, there's a tumbling around of the same shape over and over to get to the extreme of it. So I think it's the more archaic way to use the computer is actually to sculpt in this way. You know? That only Bernini will sculpt and shape so much as.
Isn't the question, put up there in terms of the quote, isn't the question really about the limitations of essentially a single methodology as compared to sort of multivalent methodologies which we have at our command in terms of how we work, how we think? It seems to me that is a kind of
the computer is.
No, it's a kind of religion and faith in one methodology, which basically has inherent limitations no matter what that methodology is.
That's
So
right.
the question is,
Somebody said it was a parallel rule and a triangle
yeah,
and
so
a
yeah,
scale. The same argument would be
So the
made.
question is, why do we limit ourselves to one methodology? Why do we have that kind of faith in one methodology, whatever that methodology is?
By the way, I think if you see the drawings that
Coy.
Pete Cook is bringing into the school, I think you'll see something which
No, I know I will.
which is quite different.
I think you're right about we, but that's not a comment about Hernan. Hernan has to have a conviction about one approach to the work. In other words, so that's not a discussion of this chair, it's a discussion of the ubiquity of a tool and a means.
My discussion was about the quote.
I don't know, that quote is, I mean, look, first of all, recognize all the disciplinary intelligence of the chair. It's got the little holes to make sure your butt doesn't stick in it. It's the relationship of the arms and the legs are good. The interesting, it's a very smart chair, a very conventional chair. It does some interesting things. And discursively, I think,
Except what it doesn't do.
The way it needs to grab,
What
I
it
think
doesn't
is
do
what-
is it doesn't look comfortable and invite you to sit in.
You said it's not the software, it's really in making that opening, you are making available as a new kind of problem for architecture. And I want you to tell us what that is. Not just that there is one. Clearly there are many.
Well, I mean, again, when I'm trying to say, especially because we have experience in the audience, is I don't think these things happen overnight. Like, I mean, part of the thing is you became. Basically, my point is, I don't think you can advance anything if you are not willing to be, let's say, provocative or confrontational, and even with yourself. I think mostly with yourself. So what I'm trying to say is, I don't think the logic that what interests me when I'm trying to produce the work today is exactly the one that it was 8 years ago. Probably similar, but there is a certain absorption that you do overdoing it again and again and again, that you start to establish a much more clear sense of what you want. So to me, what I have to do at least the most recent work, with basically this chair actually, which is still working on it, something that we sort of finished 24 hours ago. And it has to do with much more like, I would say, an ambition of aesthetic of fear, of danger, or some other territory that has to do with discomfort and a notion of a different relation to the ground of desire, which ultimately the way I see always architecture to me is a notion of management of desire from part of the author or part of whoever will receive it as an audience. In a way, I assume and I accept that is a very myopic way to see part of the way that I understand architecture in relation to anything else, and that's part I think we spend so many times arguing with injuries and over land with areas.
Coy's raising a point that might be worth rerunning, because I don't think you hear it very much around here, or maybe anywhere. Design, I mean, there's an ideological stance. I think Jeff was talking a moment ago about a hypothetical project which put you off, as the chair might put you off. And there's a kind of conceptual standoffishness which I think is intrinsic to a very old conception about the meaning of what is still called contemporary architecture, meaning the hell with the bourgeoisie, or Matisse, Monet see it one way, but Grieg, Frock, and Picasso see it a totally different way, or Stravinsky plays and people riot. So there isn't, I think, in the advent of modernism, we haven't conceded anything to this, the sense that if it has a meaning, it distinguishes itself from what is conventional or generic, or what belongs to a kind of herd culture. Now that line starts to be crossed and fudged now in a way that probably it hasn't been until recently. And so when somebody says you want to sit in the chair, and you ought to want to sit in the chair, and the desire to see an object that you want to connect with, as opposed to, I'm not going near that thing, it'll devour me. I'm not saying that ought to be your argument, but it ought to be something we're conscious of as a choice, as a way to think.
I personally think it made it clear that that's a choice.
I think it's something very common in our generation, that design is different scales, that actually when we approach a different problem, which could be the chair, it's not the topology of the chair, this is at stake. if you look at architects designing furniture or designing other things in architecture at different scale, they always go back to the typology and they have to answer the question of the typology itself. Is it comfortable? Is it a chair? Does it work as a chair? And I think we work in a much more obsessive way, maybe translating from scale to another scale and ignoring typology, which becomes an issue, yes, of not having something comfortable to sit on, but still operating on that scale. Or scaleless, meaning it goes from smaller to larger.
But what's the value of calling it a chair? What does that bring into the problem that you think is useful? If we could just call it a steel pillow.
Well, because look, I'm a man of simple things. I'm a traditionalist, simply opposite. I'm a traditionalist. I know, but I think you raise a good point, but personally, I don't have that much interest in challenging types in terms of calling it or whatever. I don't have any problem to call it a chair as far as it behaves and produces a notion of awkwardness and discomfort that has nothing to do with the non-traditional notion of the chair. So for me to call it something else, it wouldn't have that much of value. I mean, for me, it's more interesting to call it a chair, and then you feel like it's not a chair.
But the awkwardness doesn't come from the fact that you cannot sit
Chris,
comfortably.
yes.
No, an awkwardness in shape.
Why can't a chair be about causing people that take chairs for granted to think about chairs? In which case, it has to be a chair.
If that's the vision of the work, if that's the opening that he's interested in working with, then that may be the logic of it.
I mean, that might be tied to the whole issue of comfort. It could be that you look at the chair, it scares you, you sit in it, you're right. It's painful. It might be that you look at the chair, it scares you, you sit in it, and you're totally surprised that it's comfortable. And then what you begin to question is your expectations.
But I think what Coy might be suggesting, which is interesting in a conceptual way, is that actually is a very easy option now. There was a time when it wasn't an easy option because the pro forma for chairs 100 years ago never suggested that the objective was to get comfortable being uncomfortable, get comfortable with discomfort. The idea is comfort. You sit in a chair.
I'm not saying
I'm saying yes now.
I'm not saying you get comfortable by being uncomfortable. I'm saying that you're surprised that you read it, you let your expectations take a lead, you sit in it and you find out it's totally different.
I get it. The question is anybody surprised by that anymore?
Well, I tell you what, if you go by a chair, that when you sit in it and you lean a little bit, you fall over, which I do all the time. My dad, Florida furniture. I mean, basically, this chair, if you look at the structure of the way it meets the ground, I guarantee when you sit in it, you stop. So I think, I'm with Mike on this. This is a chair which is about challenging your expectations of the customary, not necessarily about, you don't know what it would be.
Chris is asking something a little different. If you look at this,
Chris is a
you look at that, you look at that panel over there, and there are a sequence of pieces. There's a frame. You look at it, you understand it. You look at the ceiling. There's a beam. There's a span. There are boards. You know how it was formed. If you look at this, the question is, in what sense is it a chair? It could be a project for courtyard housing.
Okay, well, let me ask you this.
Why is it a housing?
How about the dome in St. Paul's? You look at the dome in St. Paul's, and what do you see? Since it's a trick of structure hung by chains that nobody can see, it could have been courtyard housing. What you're asking for is a kind of direct honesty
I'm not asking for that at all. I think
No, there's a
But I think-
delicate balance in terms of perceiving this as a chair and not as a chair. Things are normally judged against types.
This is so.
This is a chair. This is a chair because you look at it, you have sound.
I understand, but what happens in terms of what Mike was saying about this issue of surprise is that the ultimate value of it is not surprise, but it's a kind of condensation of basically expectations, fear, satisfaction with expectations. It's condensation. It's compression. It's a compression of meaning, of possible understanding of this thing as the experience unfolds. That's ultimately what we're looking for. This condensation.
And the meaning is only possible through that direct experience.
Only through that experience.
Yeah. So it's not, it begins with eyeballs and ends with eyeballs, which I think is what
But how
you're saying.
about, let's be even more specific, forgetting being a chair.
relationship that I have with the chair. I mean, it has a very specific relationship with a set of specific chairs that we know and we can collect. This is not just a chair that we compare to chairs, it's a chair that calls out for it to be compared to specific other chairs. And so that's where the discourse becomes more social, more political.
Isn't this the rebuilt chair? 100 years later, it's a chair.
I mean, personally, I think it's easily seen as that. Can anybody do a computer thing once? I didn't know the guy.
Which chair?
The guy that quote about the computer. Virtual reality thing. Let me
This
tell
guy?
you-
Lanier?
Yeah, I don't.
This is from a book called You Are Not a Gadget.
Yeah, let's talk about it. I think he's completely wrong. But not because he's too conservative, but because he's not conservative enough. When I didn't put a capital letter at the front of the sentence and a period at the end, I got beat, I got grounded. 3 times I got sent home. I mean, basically the idea that the computer punishes you by coloring it red is just complete nonsense. What the computer does is exactly what he's saying it should be doing, which is to encourage us to consider other possible protocols. What I frankly think is, once you learn the rules extremely well, then, for example, I can write a sentence without a capital letter at the beginning and have it and do it on purpose and make it produce it. My technique is far more robust because I know those rules backwards and forwards and can use them effectively by both following them and
But I think what he would say, and actually we trying to get the guy here, although the fees are preposterous, is that you're acting against an a priori pro forma, which you can modify. And what he's trying to do is to get rid of that, so you're operating in a freer way. And you're not acknowledging capital letter noun for a period.
I tell you what, here's what I wish word processors would do. 3 mistakes, and the thing shuts down. That's what I think. You have to go back. That's personally what I think.
You just want to go back to the class you loved so well.
No, I just think that it's not rules are rules because we need rules. Effective rules are rules that set us free because they allow us to be infinitely creative in far more subtle ways. And I think that's in some sense what Coy's talking about the chair. I mean, you can't just call this public housing or anything you want. It's a little bit like if you call Frank Stella's painting sculpture, then they mean that they do no work, they do no art.
Is it scary precisely because you can call it a chair, or is it scary because it looks scary outside of whatever it is?
Well, the idea that a chair could look scary.
I think this is what Hernan was getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I think what
No,
he's-
I think, you know what, I think, to me,
It's not scary at all.
No, it is not.
You can make the argument it actually does what Coy is saying, and it is, come on.
Actually, why are we questioning whether it should look like a chair or not? Because, I mean, if you look at it, you can say it doesn't look like a conventional chair, but it has legs. It doesn't have to have 3 or 4 legs. It could have multiple legs. It has a seat. It has a kind of a something. No, but I think we actually are. I mean, this whole discussion has to do with imagery and a certain way of preconceived notion of what something should look like, and that's what that's what I was interested in asking Henan. I mean, is the point of fracture is to push, testing a preconceived idea of a type, or testing the way the material behave.
Well, it's a part, I mean, this whole group therapy that we're doing here is kind of tricky because it's like pointing one week of your life and trying to make sense of everything else based on that week. So, yeah, that's right. But the thing is, to me, the way at least my brain works and the way I work, this chair actually is one part of 5 projects that we're working around the same idea, which is the idea to make the skin completely independent from the structure, which is something that I think the most recent work that came from this topology and so on we're trying to embed all the systems into one, formal similarity and so on. So the chair became like a useful vehicle to start to test some of those ideas. So there was not that much of a vision in changing the type, but I think now what Chris pointed as well, I think it's an interesting one. I think to me it became more interesting. It's clearly that it's a chair. I don't have any interest whatsoever. This doesn't look like anything else. To me, what was interesting was the idea potentially to start to explore certain kind of, go back to certain kind of columns, vertical structure, the structure is independent, completely independent from the scheme. They don't have any relation whatsoever. We stick a bunch of flowers there, because it was something I was trying to explore in the notion that can also, the ornaments can be completely detached from the scheme. So it becomes much more like a prototype of developing certain ambitions that I want the work to go in a different direction than just a chair.
No,
It just happened to be that those objects are interesting to test some of those ideas.
Why do we have to learn something? I mean, this is the ethic, that it's quite a Calvinistic ethic. That if you're going to do work, do we learn more about the material? Do we learn more about the structure? I mean, it's a Sex Pistols chair in the sense that it's a stop making sense chair. It's a sense that life is only as rich as it can possibly be when we have time for torpor, laziness, indolence, excess. That if we constantly circumscribe ourselves with a neo-utilitarian philosophy of doing the greatest good for the most number of people, all we're going to do is the most harm.
No, but I don't think that this is the only version of how to do any of those things. It could just be an air pillow with exactly the things that you just.
I know, but it's not a
Yeah, but so I'm curious about why amongst all the possible choices, Hernan the cracks include this particular type.
I mean, to do a chair.
And then
No, the chair is simple.
I think it's actually nobody's talked about it, but as architecture, I think it actually is fairly remarkable as a set of assumptions about skin and structure, as material, as.
But I mean, why is it like, for example, what if you learn nothing about something?
Well, can you ever look at something and not want to get to know it?
Yeah.
I think it is full of architectural chairs that are not comfortable. I mean, I think that if you ever went to the Museum of Ica and you sat on each of the most famous chairs that architects design, none of them is comfortable. None of them has the ambition to really work with the product of the chair. There's a huge difference between industrial designer and architects when it comes to product design. Architects see the project of a chair as a project, and designers see the project of a chair as a product. And it's a completely different audience, I think. The audience is architecture on one side, the audience is applying, and whoever's going to sit on the chair on the other
It's
side.
not the problem's not the object, I think. We had started in the middle of the conversation, and Hernan simply said, this is an investigation of the interrelationship between a surface and a support system. And by the way, I decided that for the sake of this investigation, the analog is a chair. So don't ask me about whether it's comfortable, don't ask me about whether it's welcoming or cuddly or any of that, because that's not what I'm interested in. This is an investigation, and there are all sorts of chairs and furniture and pieces of building. You could argue in that sense.
But
the light project.
do I look like I care?
Eric.
For the order.
Why don't you got yourself into difficulty?
Okay.
Wait a minute.
No, do your job.
I think
Eric,
the
I want you to-
difficulty, hang on. The difficulty of the discussion has to do with the linguistics that accompany it. Because when
No, I don't agree with it.
well, that's where people say, oh, it's a chair, but it's not like any chair I know. It doesn't operate like a chair, doesn't welcome me like a chair.
But I think that the
doesn't-
chairs we talk about, the design that architects design, are just camouflaged as chairs. When you look at them, you recognize them as an image of a chair.
Can
But
he-
they're buildings. I mean, they're trying to.
What was the thing you said, how skin meets a structure? Something like that. You know, you said if you started.
That's what Hernan said.
But what if he said, I wonder if I can make a chair that can get TVMA ratings for Bibles?
What if you do?
I mean, you're constantly returning to a material, functional, structural ethic.
No, I'm returning to an association between an expressed intention, since we're talking.
I know, but
There's
the
some
intention
interest.
doesn't have to be
Otherwise,
how
let's
the
just
skin
put it up and
meets the
not talk
structure.
about it.
No.
Then why call it a chair?
Because it is a chair.
But that's an intention. And it's
Yeah,
an
but
inten-
the intention is not to explore the relationship between the skin and the
Well, how do
structure.
you know that? Until
Because
you
I can
did-
see it.
until he tells you that. Well, I don't know.
I
mean,
look
I
up
wouldn't
there and
mind
say,
sitting in there.
I'm pretty sure he's after the affect.
Well, should we guess?
But can it be interpreted in other ways?
Sure. Will it lend itself to many other interpretations?
Jeffrey, I mean, if we not describe this as a chair, then we have to discuss it as a chair, not as anything else.
But I'm saying it's a chair.
But I think Elena's point was, I can rattle off a bunch of chairs that look great because I'm an architect. You sit in them, and you get out of them as quickly as you sat.
Yeah, or even worse, you
You know,
can't.
so they really are. And it's not, it really is they're buildings. They're basically a miniaturization of the ideas that people are using in buildings. And they make for informed chair.
Okay, let's move on.
But I want
Let's
to,
move on to the last.
can I ask one question to these guys? Please.
Did you ever see the program Columbo?
It's about schools.
Do you know Columbo?
Yes,
The guy who always come back and
Remember how fast he can run?
Next one. So this is from Paul Damon. It's a discussion of fashion.
You know, it's funny. For some reason, when I read with my dad, listen, I don't understand it. Apparently, if you read like this.
And let's go to the last image. Last image. And back.
Is that pejorative against fashion?
I can't read it, guys.
Because of me.
Yeah.
I think it is, but you could argue the other way. It says fashion is ephemeral and what precedes it is more durable in meaning.
I tell you,
Yeah,
I have strong feelings about ephemerality. The more ephemeral the cultural practices, the more effective it is as a cultural instrument. Fashion, because it's ephemeral, midwife the plastics industry, midwife the
Is
self-pharmaceutical.
that why they're still reading Shakespeare?
And then, well, and, you know, it's not, we're not reading Shakespeare to find out what Shakespeare was trying to say. We're reading Shakespeare because today when you read Shakespeare, it says a lot of stuff about us.
Meaning it's durable. It's the opposite of what you said.
You know, I'm saying, for example, there's no cultural practice more ephemeral, not even fashion, than art exhibitions. Than art exhibitions. They get mounted once, no one pays attention to them, no one goes to them, they never get mounted again. They have a profound effect in the world. The more ephemeral practices, the more likely it is to have a kind of subtle and insidious way of disseminating the cultural.
No, you can tell. In the art exhibition, you put it up, you take it down, you put it somewhere else.
No, you don't put it somewhere else. You almost never put it somewhere else. Not only do you not, rarely.
You walk in the Prado and you're gonna see stuff that's been all over the place in many exhibitions.
My guess is you walk in the Prado, you don't pay attention.
Maybe go to an okay page.
What kind of practice? What kind of practice?
Otherwise, why the hell go?
Yeah, but I mean, you know, fashion, the ephemerality, the speed by which it moves through the world is its asset. And it's certainly not the end product of the flames. But I'm now going to ask my school question. Because, I mean, the chair thing is a thin disguise of something I think more important for the world of architecture. I know most of you have heard me repeat this lots and lots and lots of times. There's certain building types that have been taken away from architects because they seem to be their function seems to be too important and to be left to the frivolities of architecture. The prison and the hospital are the two most obvious examples. Right now, elementary schools are the ones that are under the most attack. Elementary schools are under attack because the safety and education of children is considered to be far too precious and important and difficult a topic to be left to the frivolities of architecture. So, the chair question. So, arguments like Rossi that we should use architecture to produce cultural diversity, sensitivity, values, by not making schools look like they should be good schools for little, it is where we should be. We shouldn't be at the expectation that we should make a chair meet all expectations.
Like 2 minutes ago, you were the guy that wanted to kick everybody out if you messed up the sentence 3 times.
Well, I don't
That's
have
a
to
very
do this.
different school you're talking
No,
about.
I'm telling you what, you know,
That sounds like a military.
there's a very famous quote that says, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds," and I believe that any consistency.
Well, you certainly demonstrated that.
Why should I be consistent?
Well, if the point was a durable point from more than 30 seconds.
No, I have a
Otherwise,
point.
you're gonna lose your
I
audience.
have a point about grammar, and I have a
You
point
gotta
about
sustain it until the election
No, I
comes.
have a point about computers and grammar, and I have a different point about art.
Should architecture be permanent or ephemeral?
Every practice, I think, has, I think time, the state of a practice, the state of an effect, it has a duration. Every practice has a threshold and an end. For example, the strength of a painting, the ephemerality of a painting, is that no one knows when it begins and no one knows when it ends. And that causes a lot of people a tremendous amount of anxiety in galleries because they don't know how to start. They don't know how to walk up to where to start, where to stand, and when they get to leave. For 20th century music, atonal music, for the longest time, audiences were absolutely in fear of the beginning of the piece of music because they didn't know, they knew they weren't going to know when it ended. And they would
They still do.
No, performers.
Maybe the problem is trying to figure out how to.
But look at the beauty of
increase the
architecture.
amount of courage in it.
But the beauty of architecture is every building has a beginning but never an end. I mean, you always know when you are going into a building. It's a big deal. So it has a profound threshold in the beginning, but it has a kind of it has a very soft, fairly insignificant ending. You leave with the expectation that people design entries, but have you ever seen anyone design an exit? In any of the houses you've designed, have you really worked on what it's like to leave? No, you've really worked on what it's like to enter. So the durations of the work.
Often it's the same point, actually.
I know, but in other words, there's such a thing as a facade, but there's not such a thing as an interior facade that they buy.
Well, speaking of facade,
Yeah,
part of the point of this discussion was the juxtaposition of.
Port of Pia by Michelangelo.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But I'm saying that the duration of the experience is different for every kind of practice, and I think that's become really important to study.
What did you say?
The Port of Pia by Michelangelo.
Because it's an interior facade.
In terms of being the gate, eastern gate to Rome, basically, instead of putting the decoration on the outside, entering, that's very plain. But the inside is very decorative, an ornate sculpture to celebrate that moment leaving rather than moving becoming. The total reversals in those notions of facade.
But I think that
That was
sense
one
that
moment.
fashion, the implication as far as I'm concerned is that fashion is not very durable. It's ephemeral. It's thrown away. It has to do with buying another washing machine or a television set or shoes. That's the way it works. And there are other items that are much. You were talking about Michelangelo. People still go see the Sistine Chapel, as far as I can tell. It hasn't run out of gas. So there must be something in there. They still go to Stonehenge. So there obviously is a quality of object and experience in Rothko.
But that goes back to the problem of meaning. I mean, the assumption is that you should work with meaning, or you should work with ambition, and your work is durable, permanent. The problem always is, how do you know that was going to be? Like William Shakespeare knew when he was writing that thing would be written.
I'm not saying he knew.
No,
I'm saying in retrospect it turned out to be so.
I understand that. I'm just saying from the point of, in the discussion in school, from the point of the people that we are encouraging to do this kind of work, I'm not so sure until what point the notion of the ambition of permanence is useful to produce any kind of work.
I didn't say it was necessarily the ambition. I said there are obviously experiences in music and art and architecture and in the making of objects that are enduring experiences.
No, but my point is this. I think there is a distinction between when you're talking about fashion as the word fashion, and there is a distinction with the discipline, let's say high couture, that have to do with fashion, because the work of Pierre Cardin in the early 60s, or the work of somebody like Balenciaga or Paco Rabanne, still matter 50 years later, still in the culture. We don't know 100 years from now what matters. But so on. So one thing is the notion of the word of fashion, you buy a notion, you discard it. The other thing is the level of expertise and the level of knowledge that go and produce something in relation to the work.
You're confusing a lot of different kinds of
No, I know.
This is an ephemeral object.
Yes.
It's not very enduring.
Yes.
It's going to go away. That thing ain't going anywhere.
As an object, but I don't know if it doesn't go anywhere because material and weight and all that. So that doesn't mean that the relevance in terms of the culture, it might go away.
Maybe not, but the mechanism implies you build a freeway system with X amount of billions of dollars out of reinforced concrete, likely it'll be around for a while.
That
doesn't make it
Make
better.
another Dodger hat. Dodger hat will be around until
That
next
doesn't
season
make
to
it
make another
better.
hat.
But that doesn't make it better.
The coat you're wearing, the design of that coat comes from the mid-'80s, about the same time Memphis furniture was being designed. I'm telling you, which one's more enduring?
I'm glad you told me that. I just got it last week.
Sorry.
Let me ask.
But it seems to me that the question about permanence has to do with, and for a certain limited period of time, the experience is authentic to the culture that created that, culture from which it was created. At a certain moment, the culture shifts. Those things then are appreciated as historic objects.
Yes.
They're no longer appreciated as authentic
That's
experiences.
exactly it.
And that's really critical.
That's it. That's the whole point. That's why you can't.
People buy paintings, you know,
Yeah, you
they
can
painted
vote
100 years ago,
with
not
John
because they enjoy that aesthetic experience. They want to own a moment in time historically.
No.
You don't go to walk in Chapel.
Walk into the caves and you look at cave paintings in Altamira, and that's because it's a historic experience?
Sure.
You seen the paintings?
Some of them are
I
not.
think talking
Good
about
stuff.
durability actually is a lot of responsibility, but also prevents you from going to the extreme of the design potential in many cases. I think that when you look at designers, fashion designers, they might go to big project all through their lifetime, and they have much more creativity. They create 6 collections a year. They're actually bursting out of projects in the sense that they cannot deal with the slowness actually of the rest of the world, I think. And in a way, that brings them also to the extreme. The fact that it's very ephemeral brings them to the extreme of the design, meaning it has to last very little time, sure, but that means they don't have to accommodate the minimum common denominator, meaning it doesn't have to be the box in the embassy that has to be the same with everybody. Because that's the other side of the spectrum. Something that is durable and represents many things through the centuries then needs to be generic enough.
My sense is that part of that has to do with trivializing anything that has the kind of durability, and everything is current and should be current.
But no, my argument
It's
is
just not, it's not so.
My argument is this, Eric. I'm not trivial, or my intention is not to trivialize durability of permanence. I'm just saying I'm not so sure how you can establish that your work is going to have that. I mean,
That's
beyond
a different problem.
Well, I
It's
think
an entirely different problem.
that's depth. The best way, if you're interested in enduring to work, is to work on a problem and then keep working on a problem and advance the problem.
That's not what we're discussing.
I know.
We're discussing whether something which is historic is ipso facto not current.
But you need to clarify something for me. That coat won't be as long as that chair, because that coat's made out of cloth and the chair's made out of metal. Is that the issue you were interested in?
I don't know what you're talking about. I think
The
what
coat you're wearing-
I don't know what you're talking about. Well, I'm saying something which is actually very simple. It's not hard to understand. Coy made a designation of what's historic. And what's historic has a pedigree. And that pedigree is why it continues to interest people, which is why they go across the bridge of sighs, presumably. Not to understand anything which would have a reading in a contemporary way, but only to participate in something which belongs to a piece of history. And what I'm saying is that piece of history has a contemporary currency. It has a meaning. It's real and it's vital in some cases, in some experiences. And it's either historic or it's contemporary. It's either ephemeral and it's alive, or it's historic and it's gone. I don't think that's true.
No, but I think
I don't think anybody's saying that.
that have that fragility in aesthetic. I mean, if you go to any mall, you see striped facade, you think that's an easy choice to make. But that's been there for 500 years.
But if something's enduring, my fashion on this end, hyper fast, nature on the other end, slow. The things that I've seen in my travels where people are trying to keep up with the speed at which money's moving, money moves faster than thought. It moves faster than conscience, but it definitely moves faster than thought. There's a point at which, there's a threshold at which things are moving so fast that you start to undermine the culture that you're copying from. As opposed to, unless you can move fast and slow motion and think deeply, very quickly. The problem with anything that's fashion, yes, it has all the virtues you say, but it's a positive virtue. I see the problem of not being able to think as fast as other things are moving. parts to lose, inherently. Things look like they look because you didn't have time to think about it very deeply. So fashion industry, okay, this year it's Montreal, so we're gonna redo all our dresses like this. Or this year, it's like Russian peasant. Okay, we're gonna mix and match. And I used to say, okay, it's possible to argue a point that says that's valid.
I think we owe
But
it
in the school,
I think we owe it to the fashion
is it valid in the school?
And we owe it to the fashion world to recognize that there are a few good designers in the fashion world and a whole bunch of hats. We owe it to the architecture world to recognize that there are a lot of hats and there are a few. I mean, I don't. Why does fashion? There's always been fashion in the world of architecture. There's always been. It has never defined the world of architecture. It doesn't threaten us. Nothing new about the acceleration of money in global culture is threatening us because of fashion. I just don't think threat to it.
I think the threat is that when it becomes overwhelming, it starts to lose the possibility of intelligence becoming manifold. Because everything is moving at a very fast pace, a very big way. And it's when things become manifold, is when things become more complex.
Well,
rich.
I guess your view is that these days that seems to be going faster. My view is pretty much goes the same speed as you're going forever since the printing press.
I think we are becoming permanent. I think there is a larger audience outside.
No, I think we will physically do the same thing. But the mind has no near structure to do this fast as anything else except.
No, it has actually nerve impulses travel 256 miles per hour and they can't.
That's a good I'm saying anything to be created outside.
I just think you
Can we get somebody to make a comment on Raymond's project vis-a-vis the
That's a kind of hard
context
way to
of
end.
an argument of fashion? Anybody want to take given the context of today, anybody want to take
Yeah, I would.
crack at that?
Because I thought this afternoon, to actually have honored Raymond would be to have had the courage to say something cautionary this afternoon, and no one did. In other words, I think Raymond's conviction was based partly on, I think Raymond was a person, and I think this project is so, it's very difficult for me to see this project, though I've been there. Raymond lived with a deep sense of the truth of his conviction and an unbearable fear he might be wrong. And the fact of the matter is, where we are existentially today is to know the necessity of living with the truth of our convictions and to act on those, and to also know we're going to be.
But you know what's peculiar about that comment, especially for somebody who denigrated a discussion of intention, that's a pretty profound clinical diagnosis of his motives, whether he was apprehensive. By the way, it was an open mic. If you wanted to say that, you're welcome to everybody who was there ready to hear it.
Oh, I tell you what. No, you're being disingenuous. It may have been an open mic, but it was a circumstance that was about deifying a lost brethren. And I didn't want to sully that. But I actually don't think it was, I think it didn't do Raymond the kind of service he fought a certain battle, he fought it in a certain way. He was a Viennese Catholic. He believed deeply in the truth of his convictions and was afraid they might be wrong. And his work expresses that, and his being in the world expresses that. And he was therefore exactly what Wolf said. Wolf said, I thought it was unfortunate for Wolf to have mentioned what he called the global, this fast global international world versus Raymond's absolute allegiance to the permanent. The permanent is not something that not only do we owe allegiance to, it is the most violent form of truth. And so I think he was a tragic figure, tragically romantic figure who refused to understand the bona fides of modernity.
The observer is the observer. I think we see what we expect to see.
That's right.
So I'd say that you're absolutely right from your point of view.
I would say that this project for me is trying to affirm and contend with its own kind of truth. And as relative as that is, it's contending with the idea of durability. And that specific, for that specific reason, it's extraordinarily fragile and extraordinarily beautiful to me. And so that's why I really enjoy looking at it. I don't know that that's a terribly sophisticated or smart kind of analysis. But because it's not, it's the concreteness of it or the weight of it, or the material of it that makes it seem durable. What makes it seem durable to me is the attempt to make it timeless and to have that as something that's so ephemeral, it's fragile as an idea that anything could be forever.
You know, we heard about it's probably unfairly submitted. I'd like to say a little bit about being a distinguished professor before I got here for, but it's probably unfairly sobering for that. But we heard about the Cooper Union as being almost like the Vatican with a Pope and a bishop. The two figures that were left out of that, or at least one figure I want to include myself, was Peter Reich, who was part of that. It was the Jew. You know, the only time there was anything funny there at all is when Peter was there, and then I came and I came. You know, it's true. You know, so I definitely think, for me, anybody that knows where they are and is certain who belongs and who doesn't belong is the scariest person on earth. And I don't want to support that.
It kind of sounds like your analysis. You just told us the way it was, and if it wasn't stated in that way, then it's no good.
I believe I said for me. Like, I remember when Arnold Schwarzenegger said California for Californians. And I thought, wow, that's funny.
I think what you're quoting is Stephen Hall's comment about why he went down there.
Yeah, no, I
and
know.
who he ran into when he was down there. So I
This
guess
photograph belies this project. And if you were to pay attention to the work today, the unbelievable effort on Raymond's part to make symmetry work again, against the utter failure of it in virtually every project, particularly the Cultural Center of New York. You know, the effort to reinscribe symmetry, Platonism, essentialism, it was just the saddest thing I'd ever seen. And this photograph is about hiding that fact about this project.
Actually, you know what's funny about that? We did talk about Plato, and we did talk about the kind of conceptual geometric ideal, and we did talk about a romantic.
You talked about it in such admiring terms that it became impossible to critically position. Now,
Yeah, but critical position isn't being single-minded, Jeff. You know, you're extremely single-minded, and I think that's an asset and a liability, especially when you look at everything through the single lens. The world of architecture, the world of construction, when you look at the world of construction and then look at the percentage of architects that are really trying, no matter what they're doing, it's really, really, really small. What's really curious is that we try to kill ourselves in that very, very small world because it doesn't align with something that I believe in.
Well, that's what I said. I actually said you have to act with the truth of your convictions, knowing full well that not only might you be wrong, you will be wrong. But that's a positive existential condition as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but apprehension doesn't, or fear doesn't only belong to Raymond. And the argument, the asymmetry argument, is already also a pretty easy one to make.
No, what I'm saying, for example,
is in an ideological sense, there's an interesting case to be made if for no other reason than somebody would find symmetry at least an intelligible conceptual discussion as opposed to asymmetry, which became the religion that you're apprehensive about.
Go look at Hernan's chair. It's symmetric. There's a difference between trying to figure out how to reanimate symmetry today and constantly reviving a lost cause of symmetrical organization.
Well, it's hard to talk to you because as soon as you continue to shift the form of the discussion, first you said symmetry.
No, I
we're talking about this. Now we're talking about an advance on symmetry, which is a different meaning. Okay, we can talk about that. It's hard to follow the discussion when it keeps moving.
Well,
I'm saying the argument that the standard generic conceptual asymmetry position belongs to a long history of contemporary architecture. Ipso facto wrong.
come on, Eric, I know this thing.
Well, you're telling everybody, nobody can tell tell you anything, but you can sit there and tell everybody everything.
No, but it's not fair to me to teach me the history of asymmetry. And
Well, isn't that what you're teaching us?
No, I'm saying that the project, you may take up the project of symmetry or not, but Raymond's efforts at that project came across to me as desperate.
Maybe there wouldn't. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe the standard. I'm not sure that means he's apprehensive.
I'm going to say two things and then we'll go. I entered architecture. Architecture, I believe, and has been philosophized by others, maybe you agree or don't agree, and is the practice above all about good behavior. It is a practice about making people behave well, having society behave well, order. When you go into a great cathedral, you want to be quiet in the presence of God, not because God's there, but because the architecture, So when I entered architecture, there was an interest in the idea that architecture, that a whole other opportunity of architecture, which could be understood as something like the political consequences of exploring certain forms of misbehavior in and through architecture. And I got deeply attached to that project. And that's just where I am. That's what I teach, so I understand the tradition of good behavior and admire it and encourage everyone to know it. I belong to the tradition of measured misbehavior in architecture. And that's just me. I met this school.
Just you. I think that's the point. I think
Well, I think
you've
this
got
school-
lots of friends.
I know. This school, when I first showed
I
up at
wouldn't
this
take
school,
that personally.
no, but when I first showed up at this school, Michael was the head of it. I mean, I did this, I thought, as soon as Michael meets me, he's going to hire us. I'm going to be the guy he most wants, and then, he didn't hire me. He said, he let me teach with drama a few times, and I thought, maybe he hadn't met me enough, so I kind of paraded in front of him, And I was always a visitor here, and for a period of time I wasn't a visitor here. And then, thank God for Hernan Diaz-Alonzo. I'm part of the place now, and it's deeply important to me for all the reasons I just said, and I'm deeply grateful for it. I'm unbelievably impressed by someone who I thought might find a place in the world as a wacko designer, turning into a mature school teacher. I mean, I think to be part of this, but for me, SCI-Arc will always be the home of misbehavior in architecture. It just is the place. That's why I always wanted to be associated with it. That's why I'm really honored to be part of the first group of people. And if there's anyone I know that misbehaved, you're the only person I ever thought to myself could actually torture a form. I said that before.
You said it many times.
Yeah, I thought, I used to think you can't torture a form, and then I saw Eric's work, I thought, oh my God, he can actually torture a form. That really should be stopped. I know I speak with a certain, and I don't mean to speak for everybody, but I definitely mean to speak to a project in architecture that for God much as I loved Raymond, that Raymond stood against. And I thought it was important to hear that. So,
This is SCI-Arc, the land of misbehavior.
And I
Jump up and spit it out.
I mean, for God knows we yelled at each other enough times in public and in private. He came to Peter's. It was magnificent. He came to he came to Peter's opening of the murdered Jews in Europe. He spoke. He was just tearing it apart, how it was built and all that stuff. But it was so loving. It was absolutely incredible. I mean, look how badly it's built and all this stuff. But it does this, but it does this, and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, I'm gonna close out a story about Raymond. I went to dinner at Raymond's house one night. The dinner was supposed to be at 9. We get there at 9. He's in the kitchen cooking. You never see him. 11 o'clock comes, you still don't see him. About 11:15, he storms out the door. And his wife says, everybody's looking around John 8, he said, fingers there, and his wife says, I think he was unhappy with the ingredients. But everybody's gone. John and Peter and I are there. Everybody else is gone. About 3:30 in the morning, he walks in with 2 bags of ingredients. Like, I don't know where the hell he gets the ingredients. Doesn't say anything to anybody. Goes in the kitchen, starts cooking again.
Well, it sounds like something you'd like.
Well,
It sounds like a guy who's friendly.
I love the story. but to be there during the storm and to never get to eat anything, I mean.
Well, you don't have much tolerance for bad behavior.
Guys, you're right. I preach it.
Thank you very much.